And good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning to you. Welcome back to Morning Musings. By the way, let me know if my sound is a little bit better. I bought myself an electronic box, pardon me, so that I wouldn't have to use just, oh, pardon me, use just the computer microphone. And so I'm able to use my boom mic here. And I want your feedback on there. Let me know if my sound is a little bit better. Hopefully it is. Uh, I mean, after all, I spent over $200 for that little silly box. Okay, thank you for joining me again here on Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore Hope, Oklahoma. We are doing a recapitulation. We are doing a refresher and a reminder of what we have seen in the Olivet Discourse in our extensive study, 2 years worth, of the Olivet Discourse. Now, in Matthew chapter 25, 14 and following, Jesus said a certain nobleman was getting ready to go into a far country, so he gathered his servants before him, and he gave to them talents. And he said, "Take care of this until I come back." So he was gone. He departed into a far country to do business there. While he was gone, the man who had been given several talents took the money, invested it, made wise decisions, and multiplied the talents. Another man who had been given less, nonetheless, got busy. He was judicious, he was wise, increased the talents. Another man had been given only one talent. He hid it in the ground. So at the return of the Lord, he returned the one talent. And by the way, it says, after a long time, the master returned. Now, commentators such as Kenneth Gentry like to say, and because Kenneth Gentry divides the Olivet Discourse, I keep waiting for his book in which he said he was just going to definitively refute me and to prove beyond any shadow of a doubt that the Olivet Discourse is divided into two subjects. He said that, I think, 2 years ago. So anyway, and he said the book was almost finished at the time. Still no book. So anyway, Kenneth Gentry says, well, see, what you've got here is in Matthew chapter 24, verse 34, Jesus said, "Verily I say unto you, this generation will by no means pass away until all of these things are fulfilled." So there's a time statement, Gentry says, that says it would be in that generation. That's true. But then he comes to Matthew chapter 25, 14 and following, and says, see, after a long time the master returned. And he says that long time must refer to 2,000 years. What hermeneutic says that? If I'm speaking of a generation, and I'm speaking of a generation that is being calculated from the present point, then if we take the biblical definition of a generation as being approximately 40 years, Hebrews chapter 3 and 4, then the passing of 20 years, 30 years, almost 40 years, that's a long time in relationship to a generation. And by the way, it's the same master and it's the same servants. So as Gary DeMar has pointed out, it's the same generation of servants. It's not 50 generations later of servants to whom the talents have been passed on and passed on and passed on and passed on. No, it's that specific generation to whom the gifts and the talents were given. The long time is to be viewed within the context of that generation. Okay, notice that we have a motif here, a theme here of what I call the absent master motif. Let me make this statement. I hope that you will think about it. I hope that you will study it. Every single prophecy in the New Testament of the coming of Christ, the second coming of Christ, is couched within the imagery, and it's couched within the context of the return of the absent master. Do you see a train coming? If you don't, I would suggest that you look a little bit closer. For instance, in Luke chapter 19, Jesus has just told Zacchaeus, "Come down, Zacchaeus. I'm going to go to your house because today salvation has come to your house." Well, you see, salvation was one of the key Old Testament buzzwords, if you please, key words of the coming of the kingdom. So when Jesus, who had been saying that he is the Messiah, proving he's the Messiah by the performance of miracles, says to Zacchaeus, "Today salvation has come to your house." The crowd was absolutely abuzz. And by the way, Jesus was in the region of Jericho, if memory serves me correctly, I believe it was, but he's headed to Jerusalem. Okay, where would Messiah come when he came for salvation, to establish the kingdom? Well, the Jews understood it, many of them did, from Zechariah. "Behold, your king comes, lowly, riding on a donkey." Yeah, they understood that somehow, some way. Now, I'm not suggesting that the Jews understood all of the nuances of that. I'm just simply saying they understood that the king was to come to Jerusalem to establish the kingdom. Here's Jesus, who's been performing miracles, by the way, now saying, and they're hearing, that salvation is come. It's coming to Zacchaeus' house that very day. The crowd is just, electricity has just gone through the crowd. So Jesus, perceiving that the Jews believed that the kingdom was to come immediately. Now, the word immediately there is from the Greek word parakrama. And it means, immediately. The Jews believed that Jesus was going to establish the kingdom immediately because he had been performing miracles. He's just told Zacchaeus, salvation is coming to your house. It's here. It's now. It's immediate. Some who try to negate the time statements of Scripture go to Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, where Jesus said, "This kingdom, or this gospel of the kingdom, shall be preached in all the world as a witness to the nations. Then comes the end." And as one former preterist claimed in correspondence, "Well, see, Christ didn't come immediately." You see, this is playing games. This is blatant contextual dishonesty. Jesus didn't say the gospel, the end, will come immediately upon the completion of the Great Commission. No. Let me say again, it's just blatant dishonesty to read the word immediately into the text. But one thing it doesn't mean is this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness of the nations. And then, 2,000 or 3,000, maybe 10,000, maybe 1,000,000 years off, then the kingdom will come. No. That is an argumentum absurdum, and it's ridiculous. Literally ridiculous. So, Here's this master, gave the talents, went away to return and to judge. Okay? He's going to judge his servants. So in Luke chapter 19, to return there, Jesus told a parable about the kingdom because the Jews believed the kingdom was coming immediately. But he says a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive the kingdom. Now look, folks, that ought to tell us something about the nature of the kingdom, shouldn't it? If Jesus was going to leave the earth to go to heaven to receive the kingdom, that tells you that his kingdom was not to be an earthly, nationalistic, physically oriented, geopolitical kingdom based on dirt. Just doesn't mean that. So he went into a far country and to return. Now, here's a question. Is the departure of this nobleman to go receive a kingdom a different departure from that of Matthew chapter 25, 14 and following? If it is, where's the proof? Now, I suppose somebody might come up and commit a logical fallacy. A logical fallacy means this. Well, to put it in the simplest terms possible, logical fallacy basically says, well, if it ain't there, it ain't there. And what they mean by that, what is meant by that, is to say, I'll make an argument. It's a false argument. Do you understand that? Don't anybody post on YouTube and say, oh, Preston, you're contradicting yourself because you always say if the words aren't there, it doesn't mean a doctrine is not there, okay? Understand, I'm going to make the argument of futurists who might possibly make the argument, even though the argument is flawed, fallacious, and fatal. Here's the argument. Here's the false argument. Matthew 25, 14 and following, a certain man was going to go on a long journey. Luke 19, 11, a certain nobleman went into a far country to receive a kingdom. See? Luke 19, he's going to receive a kingdom. Matthew 25 doesn't say one single word about him receiving a kingdom. Therefore, these are different departures. False argument, false hermeneutic, false logic. Now, I hear people making that kind of argument all the time. Steve Gregg, in his book, Why Not Full Preterism, makes the argument over and over and over again. Well, in this text, you see, we find the specific mention of the following constituent elements. In this passage over here, which sounds sort of kind of familiar, sort of kind of sounds like the same, but it's not the same because some of these constituent elements from this other passage, they're not over here. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is ridiculous. I'm sorry, I don't want to be unkind, but it doesn't even make good nonsense. By the way, in my book, my new book that I introduced in November, December, The Resurrection Feast Fulfilled, I have a very special chapter devoted to exposing the logical fallacies made by Steve Gregg when I give 6 or 7 examples in which Steve Gregg says, well, in this text on the resurrection, it mentions the following things. But although this passage over here sounds similar, it's not the same because it's missing some certain words. He uses that, quote, argument, unquote, constantly. But I show where the argument is completely false. Okay. So, Matthew 25, 14 and following, is the absent master. Luke chapter 19:11 is the absent master. How does that impact our understanding of Matthew chapter 25? Well, if it's the case that Matthew 25:14 and following and Luke chapter 19:11 and following are in fact the same parable with different elements, slightly different structure, slightly different wording, but indicative of the same events, then if I can prove that Luke chapter 19 was predictive of the departure of Christ to receive the kingdom and to come back and judge those who rejected it, i.e. the Jews, I will have proven that Matthew 25:14 and following was about the return of Christ to judge Jerusalem in AD 70. So guess what? That's what we'll talk about on the flip side.